3 decades after the end of the Cold War, the world has been undergoing a structural transformation, and at the heart of this is the attack against the dominance of the West in the global world order. This attack is led by Russia and China and supported by several nations, particularly those in the global South, that are tired of the excesses of the West on the global stage. To push this attack is the current attempt to reduce Western influence in Africa. Africa is important for 4 reasons. 1, it is the largest regional bloc in the United Nations, representing some 28% of all the votes in the General Assembly. 2, it possesses abundant mineral resources, including some crucial raw minerals that are found only in the continent. 3, it possesses some important sea trade routes, particularly in East Africa. And fourthly, the continent is home to the fastest growing youth demographic and will account for about 42% of the world's youth by 2030. So you can understand why every country wants to build a strong relationship with the African continent. Now, in 2022, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. is the best partner for Africa, but it will not force Africa to choose sides. Well, the continent has now chosen a side, and that side is China. Of course, the U.S. is not happy with that choice, and the U.S. Congress leaders are currently considering rewriting U.S. trade policy, which will force Africa to choose between the U.S. and its main rival. But before we talk about this, let's talk about China's budding relationship with Africa and how it's different from that of the U.S. and the West relationship with Africa. Now, over the last 2 decades, China has expanded quite significantly its investment in infrastructure projects across the African continent. This includes the construction of roads, railways, ports, and other critical infrastructure worth over $140 billion in loans. According to reports, as of 2020, approximately 49 countries have signed agreements under China's Belt and Road Initiative. In terms of trade, as of 2022, the China-Africa trade had surged from $11.67 billion in 2000 to $257.67 billion, making China the biggest single trading partner for many African countries. This increase in China's investment in the continent has been criticized by the West. According to these Western critics, China practices a strategy called debt trap diplomacy, which means that China provides loans to African countries that they cannot afford to repay for infrastructure projects, thereby allowing China to exert strategic control over these countries' resources. Critics often cite Zambia and Uganda as examples of this situation. Zambia is heavily indebted to China, with about $5 billion owed, which is about 30% of its foreign debt and 20% of its GDP. However, those who advocate for China's investment in Africa state that China's investment has brought significant infrastructure improvements and economic benefits to Africa. They highlight how Chinese investment has resulted in the creation of job opportunities, business opportunities, as well as facilitation of digital connectivity. The railways connecting Nairobi to Mombasa in Kenya, for example, are critical to boosting local economies. Despite these benefits, critics still argue that these benefits are overshadowed by the long-term economic risk and the lack of transparency in Chinese loans agreement. According to them, the loan agreements are potentially exploitative and can undermine the sovereignty and financial stability of nations. But the question is, how is that any different from the Western-controlled World Bank and IMF? In fact, there are more reports on how these institutions have undermined the sovereignty and financial stability of African countries that borrow from them than they are of China. If you think about it carefully, the China-Africa Loan Investment Agreement is more of mutual benefit than the West Africa Loan Agreement. Let's look at it in detail. Since independence, the United States and Europe have viewed the African continent as one that needs help, and so have traditionally focused on providing aid and social services, with emphasis on humanitarian assistance. However, this aid and humanitarian assistance always come with conditions that the West touts as governance transparency and human rights. The reality is that these conditions are actually telling African countries how to run and govern their affairs, thereby undermining their sovereignty. These conditions imposed on the aid are usually not met by the African countries, which then causes delays in fund disbursement, and sometimes the aid is not granted at all. This is why in recent times during summits between Africa and the West, you would usually hear the leaders of African countries speaking about how they have been disappointed over and over again by the West in terms of financial promises made to the continent. So, when you hear Western countries pledging to give so-and-so $1 billion to Africa, understand that most of the time, it ends in talks. There are no reciprocal actions, and that is the fact. However, this is not the case with China's strategy in Africa. As we started earlier in this video, China makes loan investments in Africa, constructing massive infrastructural projects including railways, ports, and bridges as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike that of the West, which is based on political or economic conditions, China's investment is characterized by a lack of any kind of conditions. This obviously makes it more appealing to African leaders who have grown tired of the conditionality attached to Western aid investment. For African leaders, infrastructural development is crucial for economic growth and development, and so prefer partnerships that focus on trade and business over aid and charity. In essence, the continent leaders are tired of being treated as beggars by the West, which dangles financial aid as a reward for agreeing to their demands. These leaders prefer to be treated as partners based on mutual benefit. This notion is reflected in the numerous statements and agreements that prioritize economic collaboration and infrastructure development with China. The interesting thing is that this different strategy by China and the West did not start today. You see, after African countries gained independence during the 1950s and 60s, the West, through the IMF and World Bank, provided significant funding for infrastructural development across Africa. It was aimed at supporting the newly independent nations and fostering economic development. Some of these infrastructures include educational institutions, healthcare services, and transport networks, all constructed with Western assistance. But it should be noted that this assistance and financial loans also came with conditions. In fact, it can be said that this was the beginning of the problems currently faced in Africa. When the World Bank granted these loans to Africa, it came with conditions known as the Structural Adjustment Program. This neoliberal program was focused on privatization, austerity, and forced market liberalization, which have created lucrative profit opportunities for European multinational companies, but have had a devastating effect on Africa. During the 1980s and 1990s, where most African countries were trying to stand on their feet after their independence, these programs led to decrease in income, increase in poverty, and decades of recession and stagnation. To this day, they continue to impact negatively on every aspect of the company. It's because of these so-called structural adjustment programs that the African continent could not catch up with its counterpart, thereby widening the gap between Africa and the rest of the world. After imposing the implementation of the SAP, the West shifted its involvement from granting loans for infrastructural projects to granting aid, which also came with conditions. However, China's engagement with Africa during this period was characterized majorly by ideological and possibly political support. In the 1960s, China actively supported African countries in their fight against imperialism and colonialism, promoting non-alignment and unity across the continent. To symbolize China's commitment to African development free from colonial influence, China funded and built the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. Now, let's address the accusation of the West regarding the types of loans offered by China, which create a debt trade. Basically, China offers 3 types of loans to Africa, all without any political or economic conditions. These loans include zero-interest loans, concession loans, and commercial loans, all of which serve a purpose. The zero-interest loans are provided as part of China's foreign aid programs, and there are no interests attached to it. These loans are usually used for social and humanitarian projects such as schools, hospitals, and water projects. They are like a gesture of goodwill, and their purpose is to strengthen diplomatic relations between China and the recipient country. Concession loans, on the other hand, are loans offered at an interest rate lower than that of the rate offered at the market. These loans often come with long repayment periods, and are usually used for large infrastructure projects, including railways and energy plants. Concession loans are managed by China's policy banks, such as China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. Commercial loans are provided at higher interest rates comparable to those offered by private banks and are used for commercially viable projects that are expected to generate sufficient revenue to cover the cost of borrowing. These loans are often facilitated by Chinese commercial banks and are directed towards sectors like mining, telecommunications, and large-scale projects. Sometimes, other terms are attached to the loans in the event of failure to pay, as at when due, but that is expected and nothing to worry about because China is also a sovereign country that needs to protect its investment. Interestingly, the West talks about the debt trap created by China as a result of loans, but in 2022, China canceled 23 loans for African countries. And, according to reports, it is not uncommon for China to do this. In fact, in April this year, China wrote off an unspecified amount of Zimbabwe's interest-free loans and has pledged to help the government find a way out of its ongoing debt crisis. The question is, how much debt of African countries has the West canceled? What we hear instead is how a country that is already struggling in debt is giving higher interest rates when it goes to borrow from the World Bank than what is given to a Western country. How biased is that? With all these, it is very obvious why African countries are choosing to partner with China over Western-controlled institutions. However, as we stated earlier, the U.S. is not happy with that choice, and the U.S. Congress leaders are currently considering rewriting the U.S. trade policy, which will force Africa to choose between the U.S. and its main rival. The House Ways and Means Committee launched hearings on the future of African growth and opportunity, AGOA, on June 12th. The hearings came with warnings that African countries that challenge the U.S. interest could be expelled. However, according to former U.S. officials, forcing Africa to choose between the U.S. and China is a losing proposition. This is true because what does the U.S. have to offer Africa? Expelling Africa from the AGOA might affect their economy, but they will definitely bounce back because there are other partners to choose from, including China and Russia. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.